I can see two or three corridors in the Copper Belt regions, in North Africa, in West Africa, in East Africa. There are actually opportunities for industrial zones, if you will, that would help a certain number of technologies emerge from that, including EVs. Why not?
Bady Baldé, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's nice meeting you. Thanks for
Right.
inviting me.
No, not at all. Thank you for taking the time. Now, before we get into the substance of the discussion, we are talking about a very important topic today, which is the race for Africa's critical minerals. Could you just give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself, your work, and for people who might not be familiar with EITI and the work that you do, where you're coming from in terms of this topic of critical minerals in Africa?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. So my name is Bady Baldé. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the EITI, which is, it means Extractive Industry Transparency Initiatives. So we are a global standard that promote good governance in natural resources generally, especially oil, gas, and mining. So it's an organization that has been around for over 20 years now. We have a standard that is implemented by 56 member countries, and 28 of those are African countries, in fact. So I have had the privilege to work for the EITI in the last 15 years. So it's based here in Norway. So it's been a privilege to promote good governance and transparency, and also sharing experiences across countries.
Fantastic. Thank you. Very important work, and we'll get into some of the details about why that is important. Now, critical minerals. It's impossible these days to read any news about Africa without hearing about critical minerals. And for anyone who might be wondering what it is that we're talking about, we all know that there is a global transition towards more sustainable and green growth. Essential to that, pretty much across the board, are so-called critical minerals. So things like copper, cobalt, zinc, manganese. There's a long list of minerals that go into making the batteries that power EVs and the technology that underpins, basically everything that we need to transition from where we are today, of sort of largely fossil fuel driven economy, towards a more sustainable economy. Now, the continent is home to vast reserves of minerals. We all know that, but of course, now increasingly the emphasis and focus is on getting these critical minerals. And wherever you go in the world today, there are strategies being launched left, right, and center, huge amounts of investment going into this. And for the foreseeable future, the demand for these minerals is set to grow exponentially. Now, there are a couple of dynamics in that. One is the race to get access to these, but perhaps the more important question is, how do African producers and African economies actually benefit from the extraction and development of these resources? And this is where I'm really keen to get your perspective. So first and foremost, what's your take on the critical minerals race? Where are we? What's happening? What are some of the most important things we need to understand?
Yeah, so I like your analogy of a race. So I would say we are at the starting gun. The starting gun has been fired, but we are very much at the beginning. It's not a sprint; it's going to be a marathon. Right now, to be honest with you, African countries are not significant players in key critical minerals. Most of the minerals that you mentioned there are, other than cobalt, are practically mostly produced from elsewhere. But significant deposits exist in Africa. A number of countries in Africa can play a significant role here, but that will depend on investment and government getting the investment environment right, and also improving governance, because governance has become a key factor in attracting investment today. It's not just about the geology. But just to speak about geology very quickly here, we all know that the DRC holds the largest, the world, more than 50% of the world reserves of cobalt. And we can talk more about that, how that actually influenced the evolution of the technologies we see emerging today. But we also, the Copper Belt region in Southern Africa, so in the DRC and Zambia, uh, that is hold significant reserves of copper, which is an even where the demand is projected to grow even higher in the next 10 to 20 years. Um, Other key minerals that are significant and where key countries can play a key role. So take aluminium, which is we all need lightweight materials for EVs and so on. Um, Guinea is the hold the largest reserves of bauxite again, but it's only recently that they became a major producers of significant producer of bauxite. So we see production rising there from investment from China. Other key minerals are nickel, which right now is not produced in significant capacity quantities in Africa. But there is some production in Madagascar that's actually refined. That's not just exporting raw minerals, but actually producing and refining there. But not to the quantities that would be required. So we are at the early stages here. So South Africa is a major player in a number of these minerals, but there again, we have seen investment decline in recent years. So in order to sustain that production and for those countries to meet the demand that is expected to rise in the next few years, significant investment needs to be made, and significant improvement in governance needs to countries need to keep pace with the improvement in governance as well.
Let's talk more about governance, because mining is, of course, nothing new in Africa. Yeah, we have a long history of minerals being extracted from the continent, but we all know that that history hasn't exactly been great in terms of supporting economic development on the continent. And governance is at the heart of that. You say that we're at the starting gun of this. In a way, that must represent an opportunity to get this right. Could you give us a bit of a sense of where some of the main issues are, the main challenges are that need to be addressed, and what, if anything, is being done to make sure that we don't repeat, the legacy of mining, which is, you get a railway to the coast and then the minerals get taken away, and and Africa is sort of left shortchanged.
Well, where some of the key issues are, unfortunately, many of the issues actually lie on governance issues again, where we are not starting from scratch here. There is a strong foundation to build on. There have been significant improvements in governance in this sector over the last 20 years. We are not in the wild west of the 1970s and 80s, where bribing officials was tax deductible here in Europe. And so companies investing in Africa just went about in that way. And it was the way of doing business in a way. That has changed. There are now legislations here in home countries of here, North America and Europe in particular, that prohibits corruption, bribery, and so on. There are also in those countries in Africa, governance have improved substantially. There are legislations, mining code adopted, clarifying the rules, how licenses are issued, trying to remove undue political interference in these processes, and implementation of standards like ours, the EITI standard that is now implemented by 28 member countries in Africa. It has helped provide information, create a mechanism for stakeholders to first to disclose the information, to do things properly, but also to inform citizens on what has been done, and that is being done by both by companies and by government in these countries. So we have some good foundation there, but because you asked about key issues, I would say governance is number one. the number two issue, unfortunately, in Africa, it is this lack of, we can call it lack of capital, because it's not correct to say it's lack of energy or infrastructure. That is because capital is not there. The technology exists today to develop the energy and the infrastructure, but the capital required to do that is not there. We are not seeing the level of investment going into Africa that would be required for the development of such major project. That would be the second issue I would highlight as a major issue. There are some broader issues of geopolitical nature which can work to some degree in favor or against Africa. It depends on how these things play out, but we do see a growing fragmentation in the polarized world, and Africa is increasingly finding itself in a fault line where hopefully it will not be forced to align with one bloc or another, but rather play by the same rules, adhere to higher standard. And this is why, again, we promote global standard that is accepted by everyone, saying if these resources have been developed meeting these standards in this way, they should receive the same capital and access to market as anywhere else. But that is an emerging challenge that African countries will have to navigate.
Thank you. A lot to unpack there. Let's talk first about capital. What's holding it back? I'm pretty, on the surface, a simple question, but why isn't the capital flowing in? I mean, if the opportunity is vast, right? So why not invest?
It's that's a complex question, but let me address it this way. One is the perception of risk associated with countries in Africa is just higher than anywhere else. I call it perception. I did not say the risk. I said the perception of the risk. And it's unfortunately, there is a legacy there about what is known as country risks. So risk of expropriations, risk of military coups or political instabilities, of civil war, or things of that nature that are classified as country risks. And those risks are, unfortunately, the perception of those risks for the African continent are significantly higher. And as a result, investors who have to mobilize capital to invest in Africa, there is a premium, if you will, on return on that investment because of the risk being undertaken by the investor. There are different ways to de-risk that. First of all, I think transparency and good governance, again, we would say is key, because in order to change perception, you have to show improvement. It's not enough to improve, but you also have to show that you have improved in order to gain trust from your partners. So that is one issue that is underappreciated by many African governments in their de-risking strategies. But there are other instruments as well being developed. And the African continent as a whole, and here there is a regional approach to this, it's not just country by country that will be able to solve this. The continent, as it makes more and more progress in governance, in stability, in avoiding conflict and so on, it will need to work with its strategic partners to forge long-term strategic partnerships. So it's not seen as a short-term. If we take a too short-term approach to this, you already have a high-risk environment or high perception of the risk. If you also make that timeline for the return shorter, without going into too much technical here, the net present value of the asset has to be very, very high in order for that to be a productive investment. So that's why the fortunately, the resource, the irony is the quality of the reserves in Africa are such that in some cases, what is known as mineral content is so high that the level of capital required to invest it is, in a way, it works, it makes economic sense. It's the economic profitability of the project is much more higher than in countries, in regions where the mineral content that is being of the mineral is low. So that's an advantage that the African continent has. That is, it can make more use of that because it also has an effect on what is known as carbon content of the minerals being produced. So if the mineral content of the in the ore is higher, you are removing less ore from the ground. You are investing less energies, less trucks, less machinery, less, and all that means it's less pollution associated with that. So as a result, actually, because of African countries tend to produce only from its high grade mines, therefore the mineral content is lower, and its African government needs to, and African institutions need to argue for, put that forward even more strongly in its negotiation with global partners.
Ironic indeed. Now, on the question, on the issue of risk perception, we all know, and this is one of the great frustrations of Africa, is that there's a risk premium usually associated with the continent, unfortunately. But is that risk perception this universal? Is it the same everywhere? And this kind of ties into the point you made earlier, that there's also a geopolitical dimension to this. And we're seeing, for example, a lot of investment coming from a place like China. Is the risk perception there different compared to, say, Western investors? And how does that impact the picture in terms of the kind of capital that's going into the continent?
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right to bring that forward, and that was to Africa's advantage because it was seen from with one partner with through one lens. But by having a diverse set of stakeholders looking at this issue, and you get different kind of appreciations. They have different risk appetites, but they also have different reads of what the underlying risks are. And that helps also provide more data, if you will, what actually where there are actual risks or whether there are more perceived risks that are more nominal. And China has been a key partner to Africa on that front. If you look at the large investments going on in Africa today, so take the example of the Simandu iron ore project in Guinea. It is being developed in partnership with Rio Tinto and Chinese partners, but significant capital coming from China for the development of that mine in particular. It's about $22 billion investment in a country with a GDP of 16 billion over 3 years. So it gives you an idea of what a large capital inflow it is. And many of large projects such as those hold economic potential. They can lead to an economic transformation of certain countries. Mining alone cannot develop a country. It can only contribute. It can be an active leverage point to platform to build from. And some of those large projects with significant capital coming from countries like China is important. One last point on this is we also see movement here in Europe. So we are supported by the European Union, and we work collaboratively with them. And the European Union is coming up with a very unique legislation here, which is they are not focused on a mining asset regulations like traditional mining codes tend to focus on. They are looking at a value chain approach, and they have strategic partnership with certain number of countries, including in Africa, where they have active negotiations now, such countries like Namibia and so on, and putting forward a case that we want a long-term strategic partnership for a supply that is win-win for both sides, and that is stable and predictable, but more importantly, that meets high standards of labor standards and governance and environmental standards and so on.
Yeah, so interesting picture here that's emerging. Like where else is capital coming from? Because when you look at the broader Asia region, the Middle East, the Gulf states, there's talk pretty much everywhere. Yeah, China obviously has played a big part. The EU, as you've just pointed out, is developing its own strategy. The US, of course, is also very keen on on cementing its partnerships in terms of critical minerals. Are we going to see a growing diversification of the sources of capital that are going into this sector?
Yes, that is the hope. And if African countries get this right, they should be able to secure that diversification. And in a way, if you think back to we are moving from this energy transition, coming from, if you look back at the oil sector, a number of countries, there was almost like a strategic alignment internationally to ensure stable supply of oil for the last century. And countries like Saudi Arabia were very clear about developing those kind of strategic partnerships. And now we see those countries trying to transition away from those assets are becoming major investors. So I can see big opportunities coming from the Middle East to Africa if think the African government engage this in the right way. Significant opportunities coming still from China as being the largest player in this space, but also in the European Union and the United States. Geology being what it is, there are a number of resources that we all understand that they exist in certain place, regardless of politics above ground. Therefore, we need to find our global governance structures to allow for those resources to be productive and useful to societies, both to communities living there as well as those communities abroad who need them.
And I want to talk more about the point you made around value chains, because one dimension to this debate is where the minerals, who's investing in them, who's extracting them, but of course the much more important issue is how, and you use the phrase, if African governments get this right, then you can leverage not only the capital that's coming in, but of course the value chains associated with the development of that. And there's a growing focus on not only producing and exporting minerals, but developing those value chains locally. So countries like DRC and Zambia, they've signed a cooperation agreement to develop local processing. There's even talk of battery manufacturing on the continent, and eventually even producing electric vehicles on the continent. Now, the big question, but like, what does getting it right mean in that respect, and how confident are you that Africa can really harness that opportunity, because that has the potential to transform economies and not just generate money off of mining?
Yeah, it's a challenging one. Getting industrial policy right is difficult in any environment. That's not just an Africa issue. So everywhere, you know the mantra before that was, if you read The Economist, you always see this, like government are terrible at choosing winners and losers and so on. My old professor, Danny Roderick, would argue with that. But the industrial policy done right is instrumental. And over the centuries, countries that have been successful, they had to get their industrial policies right. And key ingredients for this, and this is interesting because both you and I, we are speaking here from Oslo, perhaps smaller African countries have a lot to learn from smaller countries like Norway in this area. And that is, if you look back to the Norway here, how they developed first their hydropower sector, and they learned expertise from that to first the shipping industry, and then the hydropower, and then the oil and gas industry, and so on. You always saw a very strategic approach to this, long-term view, where first they want to incentivize attracting capital from abroad, develop local skills. Once the skills get mature enough, they expand their roles, the state's roles expand accordingly. So it's not easily done, but we have templates that has been now been successful in many jurisdictions. So and African government, here we have the African Development Bank and World Bank and others who have been doing studies on this. There are many institutions who are keen to help with this. And there are many actually scholars, economic scholars, who are in government in many African countries today who know how to put forward sound economic policies in this area. We do have to create the space to allow those policies to emerge. And that's one of the challenge that we struggle often with, because just because the policy framework exists somewhere, just because it is possible to put it together, does not mean that's what will prevail. And this is where a greater recognition needs to be made by decision makers, where by this decisions have not been productive in the past when they were made by uninformed policy choices. So how do you make informed policy choices? So for example, here at EITI, we make no recommendation of a particular industrial strategy, but we do recommend a few things: data and dialogue. Ensure that whatever policy you develop, it is built based on sound data. Because if you mandate a battery sector in an environment where you don't even have capacity for welders of, I don't know, build a road to from, you have to be deliberate about how you go about it, and having strong data to inform the strategy is critical. The second aspect is the dialogue. And here we have what we call multi-stakeholder dialogue that can be applied to many of these kind of issues. But government cannot sit alone, make these kind of policies. They will have to have a consultative process, acknowledge that they don't have all the answers, and work with companies, civil society actors, international partners, in a more consultative and curious manner to come to a solution that would work for everyone. But I think our biggest, Africa's biggest challenge here is that lack of appreciation that there is no easy solution to this and there is no quick solution to this. It's better to take a more deliberate approach to the matter.
Okay, now I mean, there's so much more that we can delve into here. Just quickly, are there any countries on the continent today where you're seeing that strategic long-term approach to industrial policy? Like a country like Morocco, for example, comes to mind to me. Like over the last 12 months, we've seen a series of like major announcements and big investment projects going into the value chain of electric batteries, for example. Like, would you put Morocco up there as an example of a country that's getting it right? Are there others on the continent?
Absolutely. I would definitely put Morocco up there for another reason, which is solar panels. And this may be counterintuitive, but it's not easy to develop heavy industry. That just takes generations of expertise. But you can build from smaller industries to climb the ladder, if you will. I have a quote from another professor, Ricardo Haussmann, who used to say, the camels and hippos don't look, camels do not thrive in the forest, just like hippos do not thrive in the desert. You have to acknowledge the environment in which you are operating, saying these are the constraints of this environment. Therefore, I'm not going to raise. I'm in the deep jungle here. I'm not going to raise camels. This is not for the, this is not their environment. Or I'm in the deep desert here. There's no chance that a hippo can survive here. So having that image is actually a good test, if you will. And on that score, I think you are absolutely right that Morocco is very high on that list in getting that right. A number of other countries are moving in a very deliberative way in that direction. Not as fast enough, but they are not alone.
All right, one final question. We are almost out of time. Just quickly, do you think that in the next 10 years we're going to see any electric vehicles being produced in Africa, or is that asking for too much? What's it going to take to get there?
An electric vehicle, if that is the policy objectives, is totally feasible. Absolutely. It's I am not so sure. Maybe first developing a certain battery technology. So, for example, battery technology is evolving quickly these days, and there is definitely a chance, high chance, that certain development corridors, if this is done in a regional manner, so if it's not just every nation for its own, if there is a regional approach to this, I can see 2 or 3 corridors in the Copper Belt regions, in North Africa, in West Africa, in East Africa. There are actually opportunities for industrial zones, if you will, that would help a certain number of technologies emerge from that, including EVs. Why not?
All right, fantastic. Fascinating topic. One of the great opportunities and challenges of our generation is to get this right. As you say, there's so much more we could discuss, but we have to wrap it up. Bady Baldé, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you so much for your insight. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you too.